One afternoon this week, I was by my daughter's school, picking her up at the end of the day after aftercare. I was chatting with a neighbor friend of ours who lives on our street, and as we do from time to time at pickup, just asking her how things were going, and her response struck me. I said, how are things? And she said, capitalism and parenting don't really go together. Mary Jo Letty, the author of this incredible short little book I'll chat out later called Radical Gratitude, is a nun, an activist, a theologian, a writer. She teaches at Regis College, one of the Catholic seminaries that's part of the consortium of seminaries at U of T. I reached for this book this week leading up to Thanksgiving to try to go deeper into that phenomenon of what it means to live a life or a posture of radical gratitude in the world in which we live. My neighbor identified the disconnect between what capitalism calls us to and what parenting calls us to. Mary Jo Letty speaks of what she calls the culture of money and the captivity of craving and culturally induced dissatisfaction. And this sermon is not a rant against capitalism or even around spending money. I'm not really interested in that. But what Mary Jo Letty speaks about struck me, that when we live in a whole society that itches us ever so slightly all the time to want more, that really does something to us. Mary Jo Letty speaks of this concept of advertising and the culture of money as making us go around with a just kind of consistent, pervasive feeling that I don't have enough. If I had such and such, car, wife, outfit, house, whatever, then that would be enough. And she says what happens when we go around with that notion that is false, that I don't have enough, that it so slowly becomes within us, I am not enough. That it becomes somewhere inside in a way that is kind of vague and guilty, but we can't really place. I am not enough. And she said that over time, the spirituality of that becomes, I am not good enough. And so what started out as wanting the latest such and such, I don't have enough, becomes, I am not enough, becomes, I am not good enough. And I think when I was chatting with my neighbor at the aftercare pickup, that's some of what she and I were connecting on about capitalism and parenting not going together, that in a culture of not having enough, how easy is it as a parent, as a spouse, as a partner, as a whatever, to feel like we're not really good enough. One short quote from Mary Jo Letty, which I thought was profound. She says, I would like to be a disciple of Jesus, and I know at times that I am not. Of this I am sure, that I have never been happier than when I took the risk of believing that Jesus meant what he said. We come today into this God story, this Jesus story, which is situated in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, which begins with the famous Beatitudes and continues for several more chapters. This story, this one today about not worrying and the lilies of the field and how everything is clothed with splendor from God, it shows up only 2 times in all the Gospels. Both times it comes on the heels of Jesus teaching his disciples about money. That's what the therefore is at the beginning of the passage. He's telling them, you can't really be a slave of both God and money. You can't serve both. And then he says, therefore, don't worry. Just as this is not a rant against capitalism or money, this is also not a should sermon about why you should feel grateful. That's not helpful. There are also times that I, like Mary Jo Letty, have never been happier than when I took the risk of believing that Jesus actually meant what he said. And what if he really meant what he said, that we don't need to worry? What if he meant that our most fundamental identity, our most look in the mirror moment about who we are, is that we're a child of God? And in light of that, our worries about paying the mortgage or paying the rent or keeping the kids clothed are important but not ultimate. This Thanksgiving weekend, we're in a different place than we were a year ago. I looked back at my notes from last year, and we were in lockdown, and for the first time ever, many of us weren't seeing the people that we wanted to be with on this weekend. And this year does feel a bit different, that some of us are able to travel and gather with some of those that we want to. And yet, for many of us, that practice of giving thanks can still feel like an edict or Jesus just talking and not connected to where we actually are. And so I wanted to close this reflection with a few ways that we might practice that giving thanks. And the first two are from Mary Jo Letty, and the last one, or the middle one, is from me. First, begin before you're ready. I think it was Pam that first wrote the line in our opening welcome about not achieving perfection, but going for authenticity. And I want to tell you from one perfectionist to maybe another out there in the audience that perfectionism is an illusion. And Anne Lamott, the Christian and writer, says something like, perfectionism is like living with held breath. And you watch all these other people jumping from rock to rock through life, having a lot more fun than you. And you think if you just stepped on one rock and then the next one perfectly, that things would be a lot better, and they're not. And so I would invite us, even as I invite myself this Thanksgiving weekend, to begin before we're ready. Some of us are facing incredibly trying circumstances and difficulties this Thanksgiving weekend. This is not a message that you should feel grateful. This is an invitation that wherever it is that we find ourselves, we have nonetheless, through the power of Christ, been given this day. And let's try to begin before we feel like we're even ready to do it. Secondly, in the next week, try to go somewhere beautiful where you are not in control. Some of us have cottages that are in beautiful places, and you've already baked in this sermon response today. You can go look out the window when you're done today and action that, which is awesome. For others of us, we're here in the city or wherever we find ourselves around the globe, and yet there's somewhere in our town, there's somewhere where we find ourselves living where we can go find something beautiful and to be reminded that we aren't in control. This is what came to me many, many years ago when I was still living in California. A girlfriend and I had broken up, and I went over to my friend's apartment. And like many places in California, all the apartments looked into a courtyard that had beautiful flowers. I had, exactly zero money. I think I somehow hopped in my car and made it over to his place. And I remember just telling him that we'd broken up and that all I could do was to go out into that courtyard. And what I remember is the oleanders there. These incredible pink and white flowers that were blooming. And in the midst of weeping at this breakup, what I remember alongside and even stronger than the pain of that moment was the flowers. Van Gogh has a painting among many called Oleanders, and he describes the oleanders, quote, blooming riotously. And sometimes, when things are most awful and challenging, when all we know how to do is weep or stumble around outside, sometimes those are the moments where God catches us off guard with something that's beautiful and reminds us and shakes us about what it is that we still do have. Third and finally, find a beloved community. This has been a 2-year stretch of isolation for many around the world with pandemic lockdowns and whatnot. And while some things like online shopping can be sustained perfectly well by doing it by ourselves, actually thrive that way, other things work a lot better in community, and Thanksgiving is one of those. I wrote a lengthy article in our newsletter this week about how we're launching small group ministry at St. Clements in a more formal way later this month. God might be calling some of us to find a smaller subset of folks that could become for us a beloved community that both gives us reason to give thanks and is a place that we can share our thanks to God. For many of us, this church at home experience since March 2020 has been a beloved community, a kind of little island in the middle of the week where we can somehow come up for air and find hope. And so this Thanksgiving weekend, 3 things as we think about practicing giving thanks. Begin before we're ready. Second, sometime this week, find someplace beautiful where you are not in control. And third, find, or maybe you found it, a beloved community and lean into it. And may God, through Jesus, fill us all with humble and grateful hearts.